Ladies and gentlemen, very warm welcome to all of you on this discussion on power supply. And what a distinguished set of panelists that we have today. We have none other than Manish Agarwal here. He's from Sterlite. We have Mr. Sushanta Chatterjee, looked at regulatory affairs and a very well-known name in the power regulation space for many years now. And we have Mr. Parag Marathe looking after the RE portfolio for GE. Let me begin this discussion by first of all, asking Manish to set the context. For example, if you could, tell us. So we keep hearing a lot about our really ambitious renewable energy targets, right, for capacity addition and how we are trying to increase the penetration of renewables, etc., in the entire energy system and in the grid. But then one of the most common questions that we generally face is about how whether or not the grid is ready for that, right? So if you look at the 500 gigawatt target, Manish, that we have, right, and it's a very ambitious target. How is the transmission grid going to complement that? Are we going to face issues? If yes, of what kind? Where exactly do you think is the need for system strengthening? Yeah.
So good afternoon, Sudheer. Good afternoon, other panelists, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you very much for inviting me here. And very apt question, how transmission can complement this 500 gigawatt RE. So I'll just go back to COP26, where our Honorable Prime Minister announced, a very bold vision for the country, which is taking a revised target of 500 gigawatt from 450. So that's a bold vision for the country, and we are all committed to do that. Along with that, I think there was announcement that we will have 50% of RE by 2030 out of the total energy consumption. That's another bold move. And a reduction of 1 billion tons of carbon emissions by the same year, which is 2030. So, which are very bold moves. And to accomplish that, I think you need a robust transmission infrastructure well ahead. In the past, you would have seen, Sudheer and everyone, that, generation has come and transmission is not there. So time for the country to think that how you can have adequate transmission infrastructure ready to accommodate those generation capacities. So this will require a lot of thrust. So today, the way I see it, CTU has an ambitious plan about transmission. They are working on the transmission plan, how to get this 500 gigawatt in place. But very important would be how it is timely implemented, which will be very critical. So I see at least 30,000 crores of pipeline every year of ISTS, which is interstate, for the next 5 to 6 years. And this is, guys, unprecedented. This has never happened before. ISTS central projects, you are talking about 30,000 crores of investment year on year, next 5 years. So this will surely help and complement this 500 gigawatt. Along with that, I'm sure states are doing something around intra-state projects as well, which will complement these capacities. So these two would be the bold moves and much required, to accommodate this 500 gigawatt capacities. Again, if I go to states, you will see that all these powers are getting injected into states. So states will have to do a lot more in terms of existing assets, how they modernize it. So in India, we have seen a lot of projects around uprates and upgrades. So these are brownfield projects. I believe that states will have to take up all these brownfield projects much more. That will also complement these greenfield projects and enable this 500 gigawatt. That's the plan for 2030. So these are some of my thoughts. But yeah, transmission has to have, has to be ahead than generation going forward. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Manish. That's one thing that I also wanted to say, that that there has been that traditional problem with transmission. We want to plan it accordingly. We want to plan it in line with the generation capacities coming online. Uh, but and that entire thing becomes slightly more complex when you're talking about renewables, because the time of commissioning of renewables is significantly less. So, for example, as compared to a typical thermal unit, which will take around 35-40 months, here we are talking about solar power plant getting commissioned less than a year. Yeah, so a lot changes on transmission front from that point of view, right?
Correct.
The grid managers have to work round the clock to ensure that there is absolutely smooth commissioning.
Yeah, you're so right. Gestation period of generation 1 to 2 years or less than a year, while transmission projects today with the challenges that we are seeing, it takes as good as 2 to 3 years. So
Manish, the other thing that I wanted to understand from you is, when we are talking about transmission, having renewables as part of the transmission, getting their integration into the grid properly. We have this national, aim of green grids, right? We keep talking about these things. Where exactly do we stand? If you can throw some light on that.
which you're talking about green grid.
Yeah.
So I think, again, in transmission, you don't have so much of losses as in distribution. So AT&C losses have been there. But if we're talking about green grid, then I think one thing you are fundamentally seeing a change, which is, today greenfield projects, you have lines getting built with HTLS conductors, which is high temperature, low sag conductors. So that offtake has recently started, which was not there in the country, which I must appreciate the move of MOP and CA to induct those. And today, as I was talking about brownfield projects, where you are doing a lot of upgrades and upgrades, you are seeing a lot of innovative products which are high performance categories around high temperature, low sag. So, which is again, complementing towards lower carbon emission because those have lower losses. And I did talk about brownfield project where, on the same corridor, you are increasing the capacity by 10 to 30x. For example, we are doing an upgrade project in Kerala, which is Transgrid, and we are in the same corridor upgrading the networks, and that will carry at least 20 to 30x the power. So again, it's about all these green initiatives, small initiatives leading towards, making the grid greener, smarter, and stronger.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. And before we, delve deeper into the topic, I've also wanted you to maybe help us understand what exactly and typically are the kind of challenges that transmission systems generally face. Because timing is very, very important. Timing of commissioning, long gestation periods are there. Significant investments go there, and we can't really afford to have time or cost overruns, particularly in transmission projects. So what exactly are typically the kind of issues that we face, and what kind of support would the industry typically expect from the government for this kind of projects?
Thanks, Sudheer. Another very apt question, challenges in transmission. So let me first of all compliment the government of a couple of moves. I did talk about they are doing a transmission plan, which is going to get released, I hear, in a month or two by MOP, taking care of that 500 gigawatts. So I must compliment the government's move there. Second is I must compliment MOP and DPIT. They have got this PMG portal, which is tracking all the projects in terms of how the projects are progressing, what are the bottlenecks being there, and how to resolve them. So that's another bold and great move, which we are getting a lot of support from. And third is the GNA, which is notified and due to get released. So these have been a lot of good moves, but challenges, I have a couple of them. So I'll just go one by one. Give me 2-3 minutes, so I'll elaborate, a couple of them. First one I see, Sudheer, is, to achieve this 500 gigawatt, as I was saying, you need, on the interstate especially, 30,000 crores of projects year on year. And today, if you see from a RPC to the bidding, the average time is 365 days, which is very huge. I think we'll have to look at how to reduce the time. Last year, if I see, though we had COVID in quarter one, but we could only see about 6,000 crores of projects last year getting bidded. In Q1, I am seeing again 3,000 crores odd, which is averaging about 12,000 crores vis-a-vis the requirement, maybe 25, 30,000 crores. So this is concerning. I think there is something which MOP and government will have to be looking into it in terms of reducing these timelines. Again, the GIB thing that you guys would be reading in newspapers and news, which is, considering all those into fact, the way it is going, again, against 25,000, 30,000 crores, I am seeing only 12 to 15,000 crores of visibility. So that means a lot of lag in transmission. So this is another challenge where I think one is I'm talking about RPC2 bidding. How do we take care in reducing the timelines, take care of GIB issues from the PMO, from MOP, much more in a better fashion in order to see that, projects come in time. Then second one I would say is, the RTM versus TBCB. I see still a lot of projects getting awarded under RTM into interstate based on compressed time schedule, or the reason being they being strategic or in sensitive areas. Well, in the last couple of years, we have seen, that private sector has played a very pivotal role in doing the projects in around the time as per the SCOD around Jammu and Kashmir, Arunachal, and other northeastern states, including HVDC projects. And we all know the advantages of TBCB, which has much lower cost, 30 to 40% lower cost. So this is again, I am seeing that, how the government gives more thrust around competitive mode of bidding around transmission projects, so that all the projects are getting bidded out on tender basis and we get away with the RTM mode. Then third I would move to is around freedom of design. So today there is a CA technical regulation. If you go by that, then you have a lot of play to do the innovation and try out new things. But again, if you see the RFP, that limits the usage of that band. So I think there again, how do we promote, or how does the government bring those aspects into RFP where people are able to, the companies are able to try more new methods to take care of doing projects with lesser time and lesser cost. Then I would say that there's clearances. We are doing a LBTPL project in Gujarat, Lakhadia, Vadodara project. It's got 143 crossings. We are doing a lot of projects into Northeast, Goa and all, where, you have forest, wildlife issues and all that. So I think today we need a kind of single window clearance, space to be set up where these clearances come more in time to have these projects get executed as we want in 2 years to 2.5 years. Again, here I would like to emphasize, that MOP should go back and look at the past performance of projects where they have been significant forest and wildlife. They are still getting bidded out at 18 to 24 months projects. But if you see the real picture, it is 30 to 36 months. So if the real picture is that, then I think government should take a cognizant view and correct those, now itself, so that tomorrow you don't face the problem of, gap between generation and transmission. Another thing I would say here is early commissioning, So in transmission, today you are talking about 18, 24 months project. So there should be early commissioning incentive that government should think of. What will happen is, Sudheer, once you do that, you are promoting, the players would try out new technology, bring more innovation to execute the projects in lesser time at lesser cost. So these are some of the things I think the government should look into to, overcome or help the industry by overcoming these challenges, so that, these projects are built in time and with lower cost. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Manish, for those relevant comments. You're saying a lot of really important things, including on clearance front. But we were made to believe that perhaps, that issue of the traditional issue of delays, etc., because of ECs and FCs, that burden has come down slightly. But yeah, so we'll see where we go on that. Yeah.
So one more thing I must tell everyone, I forgot to mention one. The challenge is today the largest investment is happening in transmission, and if you see, bankers are not willing to accept any cost escalation which is happening when you are executing the project. So you have a lot of ROW costs coming. And so today you see that states have this 85-15 compensation guidelines. Many states don't fall in line with MOP's revised guideline, or they have their own guidelines. And these are the things where, when we bid, the players bid, they take some assumptions which is not appropriate, and when they execute, project delays happen, and there are significant ROW cost escalation. So this is another area where I feel that central government should come forward and ensuring with the states that there are right compensation guidelines which will enable not only the sector but also the banks would be very happy to fund certain part of it, and today it is humongous. Thank you.
Thanks, Manish. Let me turn to you, Mr. Chatterjee, and you have listened to this entire argument so far. From the point of view of a company, right, where we are talking about the pace at which projects are getting commissioned, the investment that is going there, what could be the challenges, opportunities, etc. As somebody who looks at things from the regulatory side of things, right? I want to ask you, what is at a very broad and basic level, what is the current state of affairs with the Indian grid, in the sense that are we doing the right kind of the way resource adequacy framework has to be done, right, from the point of view of system generation management? Are we doing all of that, right? And we have just seen a few very recently we saw how there were blackouts at some places because of excessive demand, etc. All the multiple factors were involved. But we are time and again made to believe that we have a very robust, modern, resilient grid. So there is something that's so there's a puzzle there, right? Can you help us solve the puzzle? Yeah.
Thank you, Sudheer, and thanks ET for inviting me. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. Yes, I think resource adequacy framework that you highlighted is really critical. And what do we mean by resource adequacy? Whether you have adequate generation and transmission resources. We have been talking about transmission to meet your demand in different time spans all through the day, and for a certain foreseeable future. That's the fundamental construct and concept about the resource adequacy. So that's a critical question, and our assessment has been that possibly because we did not spend a lot of time in creating proper and robust resource adequacy framework in the past, we have landed in a situation where we are today, where either we have huge surpluses lying idle, and we clamor about stranded assets and stranded costs on the generation side, or we have situations like the one that we are seeing now, starting from April through May, and now also in June, when the demand has crossed to 10 to 15 gigawatt, and despite having more than 400 gigawatt installed capacity, we are not able to meet, and we have blackouts. So possibly these realities, and in fact there are some reports that we have come up with just a couple of months before the March-April phenomena of high demand and we not being able to meet the entire demand with such huge capacity. In one of those studies, it comes out that states are saying that, see, we have huge surplus capacity, for which we are paying fixed costs, but are not able to utilize them fully. The situation suddenly changes. So what this brings to the fore is the need for a robust demand forecasting to start with. That's the fundamental construct around the resource adequacy framework, that you need a scientific demand forecasting over a longer duration. And then, what possibly, what has come out is that in several states, still demand forecasting is done based on an Excel sheet analysis. I mean, you need econometric analysis, you need probabilistic analysis. I mean, you need to really factor in so many dimensions. Only based on your CAGR, if your demand has grown at a CAGR of, say, 3% over the last 10 years, if you are projecting your demand for the next years only, next 10 years only based on your CAGR, you would land up in a situation where you are today. So you need a complete rethink in the kind of demand forecasting that you are doing today. Followed by that, you also need to think in terms of having adequate reserves in the system, which we also, I mean, traditionally what we have done, we have looked at our peak demand and procured power, possibly base load. We have contracted base load generating stations to meet our peak demand, which leads to a situation that in times when you don't have peak demand, you land up with stranded assets and stranded costs. So it's a holistic approach that really is required, starting from scientific load forecasting and then identifying right energy mix. It's not enough to contract, only look at your peak demand plus the reserves requirement and contract the base load generating station. So you need to understand the dynamics of your load over the period. If you need to supplement your peaking requirements in the evening and in the morning, you don't need to contract base load generating stations. You need a completely different strategy for doing that. So that's one thing which, in fact, as policymakers in the government as well as regulators, we have been trying to work on. I mean, that's in brief in terms of the overall framework of the resource adequacy.
Yeah, okay. This is very interesting because it's a very recent narrative. This entire thing about the way we are doing our planning when it comes to managing demand and supply, etc., for power. We are not particularly at the level of states. We are not following the right econometric models. We are this Excel sheet based forecasting, for example, like what you mentioned. So I just want to understand very quickly, if you can answer, why is the situation like that first? And secondly, from a regulatory standpoint, are there any interventions possible to take care of these things? Because otherwise, this has been there for quite some time. So how do you address that problem as a regulator?
Yeah, I mean, I said most of the states. I mean, there are some states. In fact, we have been engaging with the states, being part of, I mean, as central regulator, we chaired the forum of regulators, and in fact, we have quite a good number of progressive regulators in the states, and there are some good examples in some states where they have been making efforts in trying to improve their forecasting technique. But then, as I said, it's been a traditional approach, and quite often it's been a blame game. I mean, quite often we have seen that some of the states would blame the Central Electricity Authority, CEA, because they come up with what we call EPS, Electric Power Survey, where there is a demand projection. So they said, see, whatever power procurement planning that we do is based on the estimates that CEA gives us. Whereas CEA says that, see, our EPS is totally based on the inputs that we get from the state. So that's been going on for quite some time. But yes, as you're right. In fact, a lot depends on the regulators, especially the state regulators, because it is they who will have to, I mean, what we are trying to work on is a regulatory framework around this resource adequacy, for which the starting point would be the robust load forecasting. There have been a couple of studies with the help of, say, USAID, where they have developed a tool which has been tried in 2 states, Assam and Jharkhand. And we have been trying to ask them to engage with some more states and try and fine-tune their own. It's not enough that whatever tool that you have developed based on the experiences of 2 states might be applicable for all states as well, all states across the board. So we have been, in fact, asking them to engage with more number of states to make sure that we have uniform and robust load forecasting, and that, in fact, would come through a piece of regulation at the state level, which will make the state distribution companies do proper load forecasting.
But we have, from a regulatory standpoint, we have interventions like time of day tariff, etc. Right? That doesn't help you in terms of managing the demand properly.
No, that's fine. I mean, yeah. TOU, time of use, time of day tariff does help, but then what happens is that this is something which is limited to specific consumer categories. It's not applicable across all. It does not apply to domestic consumers. It's largely in several states that we have TOU. It's largely applicable for industry, but yes, they play they have a sizable share in the overall consumption. But that's one point which can help you do that. What I'm trying to say is that when you are projecting your demand, say sitting here in 2022, you need to project your demand up to 2030, because you need to do a long-term procurement planning for generation as well as your transmission. So when you are doing that, you need to factor in these things as well. As a regulator, you can induce them to go in for, induce them through TOU, time of use or time of day, or even people have been talking in terms of dynamic pricing. Time of use, it's one step beyond that, which will take time, but since it's not universally applicable for all consumer categories in all states, it has its own limitations in terms of flattening the load curve.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Very interesting comments, Mr. Chatterjee, and it's a bit of a complex kind of a thing to manage, no doubt, but a lot that needs to be done. Parag, let me turn to you here and ask you. You are somebody who looks at the renewables, the entire interface of renewables and the grid in GE. I want to understand what is your outlook of the complexity that is getting built in the grid, currently, simply because of integration of renewables, and even on distribution side we have prosumers. Consumers are now becoming prosumers. So there's a lot of a lot of change that is happening there. So how do you look at that? If you can throw some light on that. Yeah.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you for the opportunity and good afternoon, everyone. We heard from both the panelists about regulatory topics as well as commercial and implementation challenges. I would like to focus more on the technology challenges that the grid is exposed to. First of all, the grid that we have, whether it's 100-year-old or 150-year-old, is the most complex machine that humankind has ever built. And it is getting more complex because we are going to add more and more renewables onto the grid compared to the base load fossil fuel generation that we are so much used to. We heard about this 500 gigawatt figure by the end of the decade. Today we are at 157 gigawatt of renewable. So that is going to go significantly from 157 to 500. And that pace of acceleration, provided the implementation and commercial challenges and also regulatory support is resolved, it's going to definitely increase the amount of new megawatt or gigawatts getting added onto the grid, and grid is going to get more complex. We will talk about the challenges associated with the addition of solar and the wind renewable resources. But before that, what we have been discussing yesterday as well as today in the morning, I heard about hydrogen. The topic is a lot more bigger than just grid. It's what we call as energy transition. And whether it is grid, whether it is hydrogen, or whether it's fossil generation, any topic, what we are essentially trying to solve is the energy trilemma. And I'll mention briefly about what is that energy trilemma that I'm talking about. Ultimately, we are trying to solve three parameters. One is, and that's the trilemma, affordability, reliability, and sustainability. And that really applies to everyone, right from generation to transmission to distribution and also to utilization, because this trilemma and the answers for that should be positive for all these classes of consumers and the entities in this value chain. Now, let's talk about the future of the grid, or grid of the future, whichever way we want to call it. The significant capacity addition that we are going to see, and it's going to happen. Government is already having the schemes like PLI or Green Energy Corridor and RDSS and things like that. Plus, the vision for the country is to get into 5 trillion and more economy. The need for electrification, industrialization is definitely going to only go up. And my feeling is that the pace of this addition is going to even increase faster than what we can imagine today. So the grid of the future has to not only accept and manage these growth by sheer addition of the resources such as transformers, hundreds of kilometers of transmission lines, circuit breakers, distribution centers, substations, etc. It also now has to address the other problem or challenge, let me put it this way, of renewable coming onto the grid. And I'll just mention one, and then we'll get into deeper discussion later on. For example, we are setting up a plant, in an area which has a lot of solar potential. It has a lot of sunlight through the day, through the year, and things like that. Maybe regions like Ladakh or Rajasthan and things like that. And that region has a potential to generate hundreds of megawatt during the day and put it on the grid. But those areas are not close to the loads. The loads are in elsewhere. So we need transmission lines, and definitely to reduce the transmission losses, we might think of HVDC lines coming in, bringing that power to the city centers. So that we already know today. But the solar plants do not generate enough reactive power, which is very much essential to make sure that the balance between active power and reactive power making the grid more stable. So we will need to have STATCOMs or static compensators or static VAR compensator or synchronous condenser closer to the generation to be built so that we are able to compensate that active reactive power balance and then improve the stability of the grid. Like that, there are 3 or 4 more bigger challenges that are going to be faced by the grid of the future. And the good thing is that, and I heard earlier panelists mentioning that this future is not really 10, 20 years away from it. It's here and now. Luckily, for many of the challenges of this future that I just talked about, or the renewable challenges, we do have the solutions here, and we are, of course, continually improving on it. So that would be the focus on technology standpoint.
What about digitalization? A lot is being said about that. In fact, people say that apart from decarbonization, decentralization, the other big D that we have in the energy sector is digitalization. And the transmission grid is definitely one area where a large part of the impact of digitalization is going to be seen over the next few years. So when we're talking about the ideal grid of the future, right, how do you see digitalization plays there? And if you could specifically talk about maybe a few things which will help us understand what exactly it is that we're talking about.
Sure. So besides adding the things that we already know, like transmission lines, transformers, and STATCOMs, and substations, and circuit breakers, etc., we have to also address the challenges that are being posed by the renewable growth. And these are technology challenges, and you mentioned about data. Data is definitely going to help us because we collect, even today, a ton of data. Not every piece of data is getting used properly, but there are ways that we can interpret the data and then make it actionable information. So let me first start with a challenge that we are seeing today, even in India as well, is the growth of distributed energy resources. We already knew that we used to have power centers, power plants, big power plants at a particular location, and then the power used to flow from the power center to the city centers or the industrial locations. Today, we have smaller wind generation plants, smaller solar farms, even rooftop solars, and they're all spread over geographically as well. So the power is no longer unidirectionally flowing. It is multi-directional. And in addition to that, we have several microgrids coming up, which have the ability to disengage if they sense a problem with the main grid and continue to provide power to their respective users, but also keep engaged, connected to the grid. That is what I mean. When everything is fine. So these are the newer elements or animals coming into this picture that we require, or the grid of the future needs to manage. And one of the key technology that is required is better and faster controls, what we call as orchestration of these energy resources. That is really going to be the key to help the power system operators to manage these different resources, multi-directional power flow, and things like that. The second topic that I want to really talk about is about the intermittency of the grid. Now that's well known that sun doesn't shine always, wind doesn't blow always. At the same time, we heard today as well in the morning that we need to have a consistent base load and easily dispatchable power for some of the operations like refinery, as one of the panelist gentlemen said, that it's 24/7 and we can't accept that, okay, in the evening we don't have power because it's all dependent on sun. So we need to have that integrated into our system. But to be able to do that, we like the fellow panelists just mentioned about ability to anticipate the demand in a even more increasingly unpredictable world. That is really the key, and that's where the data comes into picture. We got to interpret the data, and today we have the technologies like artificial intelligence, machine learning available to interpret the data, take the historical trends, and also apply the real-time information that is happening around us, because we collect ton of data today, and there are zillions of sensors all over across all components of the grid. The data is coming in. These technologies are helping us to interpret the data, convert them into actionable analytics, more predictive than just real time, and then help that integrate to the grid system operators, their own systems, their own machines that they operate, and they connect or manage the grid, so that it's easier for them to take decisions when they do have time. For example, the technologies or the forecasting technologies can help us give a day ahead or even an hour ahead prediction of the demand, and that way we will be able to manage our resources from the grid standpoint in an affordable manner to manage this grid and also satisfy the demand. Another topic based on the data is many of the grid operator systems, and we do have in GE as well, is the asset performance monitoring systems. Now, these are pretty vast systems, and as a grid operator, the APM or asset performance monitoring system can really help the grid operator to manage their assets, know what asset is coming off from its warranty, spares, as well as based on these predictions, which assets are going to be needed to be used, whether it's maintenance crews, whether a crew to be dispatched to the center based on, let's say, weather prediction that is going to be a cyclone, or there's going to be a weather event that we need to take care of it, so that we can avoid the downtime by planning ahead and hence minimize the cost. Those are going to be really essential tools that, based on the data, we can interpret and help our grid system operator to address the problem in a cost-effective way. Because as I mentioned, this is a trilemma. Just like the users, we are also, as a grid solution operators, as well as OEM, need to solve this problem of affordability, reliability, and sustainability. The third one, which I would say slightly lesser in intensity, we talked about decarbonization and climate change all over. Mostly people associated, and rightfully also from the volume standpoint, to the generation, because that is where the fossil fuel generation is there. But we also decarbonize the grid, and grid of the future should have the decarbonized grid as well. One of the components today in India, as well as in, of course, all countries, is gas insulated switchgear, and that uses highly potent SF6 gas, which is greenhouse gas. Now, we do have in GE, we have a green gas for grid, we call it GQ gas for short, that completely eliminates all the harmful features of this SF6 today, and we can totally, to the extent of 99%, eliminate the impact of that. It essentially is a composition of carbon dioxide, oxygen, and a dielectric fluid by 3M called 4710, which really helps us in decarbonizing and reducing the carbon footprint of our gas insulated switchgear. Another small point is for low power transformers, today everyone uses the mineral oil, which is of course a fossil-based oil and has a carbon footprint also. But we can use biodegradable oil generated from vegetable sources, so that reduces the entire carbon footprint for low power transformers, and that technology is available today. So these are some of the challenges that are coming up, and we do have solutions for some of them. For some of them, we are evolving the solutions so that we are ready to implement the grid of the future. We will talk about the stability, which is of course very, very important a bit later.
Yeah, thank you for that comment, Parag. Mr. Chatterjee, if I can, ask one last question to you is, it would be about when we. So he has talked about microgrids, right? And he has also talked about DRE. So there's a parallel universe in the distributed space, right? From a regulatory standpoint, how do you look at it, right? What are the typical challenges that exist in managing the regulatory side of things there, or is it to a large extent, in the state's domain, and they are able to do a good job? How do you look at it?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, what we have in mind or in our landscape is what we call distributed energy resources, the DERs, which has a larger canvas in terms of microgrids, off-grid solar, off-grid wind, or using the local biomass and all that. I mean, there is a need for encouraging the distributed energy resources. Another important thing that we quite often lose sight of, and which we are trying to at least emphasize, is on the demand response. It's not always necessary that you set up new generation capacity to meet the demand. You can go the reverse way. You can reduce your demand through energy conservation or through a innovative mechanism of what we call demand response. Demand response is also treated as one of the ancillary services elsewhere in the world, where what happens, aggregators pool together consumers who would be ready to reduce their load when the system peaks. So that's in a way substitutes the requirement for adding new capacities, and also adds to your decarbonization to a great extent. So in our larger canvas on what we call distributed energy resources, we do have a lot of focus on microgrids, on the off-grid solutions. There are states who have come up with appropriate, regulatory mechanism, some incentive, disincentive mechanism. There are provisions where, the requirement of licensing, for instance, one of the encouragements is that if you are in a notified area, in a rural area, and are engaged in distributed energy resources called generation and distribution, you are exempted from the hassle of licensing and tariff. You can do on your own. Some broad regulatory framework has also been created around that, but yes, it's easier said than done. But the point that I'm making is that this area is really, really critical as we go along. Instead of adding more capacities, if we can, and it also helps you reduce your losses significantly, because the moment you have large generation connected to the grid, you need to extend the grid all the way, which is not really economical and viable. So it helps you reduce your losses. It helps you address the local problems. You can more optimally utilize the locally available resources. So the more we do, the better it is. And there are policy and regulatory frameworks, and of course, it's one of the important priority areas for the regulators as well.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chatterjee. I think we can close the discussion now, unless Parag, you wanted to share something about security point of view from the grid side.
I'd like to mention one important point, which is stability and security of the grid, and that's really an elephant in the room, because we know that renewable energy sources are intermittent in nature. Today, when the grid is fed by or powered by the conventional power plants, which have large rotating generators, they inherently provide this inertia of the grid, and that is able to handle the frequency fluctuations today. Most of, or rather all wind turbines as well as solar plants do not have these large rotating inertia that they can bring in and help, or inherently help the stabilization of grid. They are essentially power electronics converters and inverters, and they don't provide or feed in any inertia. Now, the challenge here is that in these circumstances, when more and more renewable sources are coming in, how we can help the grid to be more stable. And there are a couple of technologies that are available, and also some of the algorithms or controls algorithms that are available. A couple of them are like primary frequency response or rate of change of frequency, and we can build the controls based on that to address and take the control of the grid and manage the demand and the supply. The second one that is about the two technologies that we all, probably most of you already know, is the grid forming technology and grid follow technology. These are the controls concepts where, using the same power electronics that we have as a part of the renewable and the wind and the solar generation, we can implement this grid follow and grid forming controls to modulate the voltage and inject the power to make sure that the grid doesn't go out of control. These are the technologies. A lot of more work is actually happening, and it's going to get even better in terms of refinement of these controls, data-driven controls, to make sure that the grid becomes even more stable than what we have today, despite the addition of renewables. So that's something as a part of the grid of the future that we are anticipating more and more controls. But these technologies are available today. For example, in terms of wind turbines, they do have something called as zero voltage or low voltage ride-through, which is kind of equivalent to that. Suppose even if you lose some connection to the grid, it doesn't totally go out of the sync. It kind of stands on the grid for microseconds, etc., can help to some extent be in sync with the grid and doesn't go into a catastrophic failure. So some of these are already available. Some of these grid forming are evolving also further. So that's component of the future of the grid. And other one, the last point from my side really is security of the grid. When I say security, it is the cyber security that I'm talking about. We now have increasing more assets connected to each other and also connected to the internet. So they are naturally exposed to any kind of cyber attacks, any unintended attacks from other elements. So the approach that we have to follow is, and we do have standards to kind of define some of the applications and equipment. So the approach we have been following is threefold. One is secure by design. Whatever equipment that you are putting on the grid or connected, whether it's software application or any hardware embedded controllers, etc., they should be secure by design in first place. Second item is that they should have the capability to repel these attacks and protect your critical infrastructure, because grid is the most critical infrastructure that we have, and we have to protect them. And the third one is continuously learning and patching and upgrade of those services so that we remain secure for the entire period of time and make ourselves step ahead of the hackers that are trying to create problems for the security. So stability and security both are equally important in my opinion.
Yeah, okay. Manish, any quick comment from you to wrap it up, or we should?
No, thanks, Sudheer. I think it was a very engaging and wonderful session. Thank you to the other two panelists, and you have apt questions. I would say we are in a very exciting times. Outlook is very strong. Our PM has committed towards 500 gigawatt. Everyone has to contribute, and we are seeing a multi-decade of energy transition happening globally. And we can talk about Sterlite power because I come from there, and we are looking at very meaningful and sustainable way in contributing towards decarbonization and limiting that climate change. So that's our commitment, and we are there. We have done a lot, but more to do for us and the industry. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thanks, Manish. To wrap it up, I would say, a lot of important points have been made by these panelists here. We started the discussion with Manish talking about how, if you look at the size and the scale of the opportunity that exists in transmission, 30,000 crore worth of pipeline of ISTS projects every year, that's a lot, right? And he's basically talking about at least 2-3 main problems, issues like GIB, issues like clearances, and the need to kind of reduce the timelines that are involved till the bidding stage, etc. But at the same time, it's heartening to see that the TBCB model has worked, right? And that's the way going ahead. He's also saying that we also should have some kind of incentive mechanism for early commissioning of transmission projects, which is again a very important point. We had Mr. Chatterjee talking about the need for a very robust resource adequacy framework, particularly in the light of the increasing complexity of the grid and how we are going to in future look at the entire generation mix and how we manage it. So that's a bit of a complexity to be managed there. And he also talked about distributed energy resources, how we are trying to develop a regulatory framework that addresses the specific challenges in that entire universe. We also had Parag talking about increasing complexity of the grid and the trilemma that we have, right? Very important point he made. And he has given us a lot of perspective from the digitalization point of view, right? How to secure the grid, what steps specifically are to be taken there. So overall, a very engaging discussion. Thank you, panelists, for your time. And so thanks. Please carry on. Thanks.
Thank you, Sudheer. Thank you, everyone.